Dr. Elena Vasquez woke up every morning at 5 a.m., not because she wanted to, but because the nightmares wouldn't let her sleep anymore. For the past 3 years, she had been having the same dream over and over again. In these dreams, she could hear the earth crying. It wasn't just a feeling or imagination. She could actually hear it, like a mother calling for help for her dying child. Elena was a climate scientist who worked at a big research center in Colorado. She had been studying weather patterns and climate change for 15 years. But what she discovered in 2023 was something that no scientist had ever seen before. The numbers on her computer screen didn't just show that the Earth was getting warmer. They showed something much more frightening. The Earth was dying, and it was trying to tell us something. Most people think climate change happens slowly, like watching grass grow. But Elena's research showed that everything was speeding up much faster than anyone expected. Ice caps were melting 10 times faster than predicted. Ocean temperatures were rising so quickly that fish were dying in massive numbers. Weather patterns were becoming so crazy that farmers couldn't figure out when to plant their crops anymore. But the strangest thing Elena noticed was that all these changes seemed to follow a pattern. It wasn't random chaos. There was something organized about how the disasters were happening. Hurricanes were hitting specific areas at exact times. Earthquakes were occurring in sequences that almost looked like they were planned. Even the way snow fell in some places created shapes that looked like symbols or letters. Elena spent months checking her data over and over again. She thought maybe her equipment was broken, or maybe she was making mistakes in her calculations. But every time she ran the numbers, the same patterns appeared. The Earth wasn't just changing randomly. It was trying to communicate with us. One cold Tuesday morning in March, Elena made a discovery that changed everything. She was looking at atmospheric pressure readings from weather stations all around the world. When she put all the data together on one big map, she couldn't believe what she saw. The pressure changes formed what looked like words. Not perfect words like you'd see in a book, but close enough that she could read them. The message was simple, but terrifying. Help us. Time running out. Last chance. Elena stared at her computer screen for hours. She rubbed her eyes, thinking maybe she was seeing things because she hadn't slept well in weeks. She asked her assistant to look at the same data without telling him what she thought she saw. After 30 minutes of studying the patterns, he looked up at her with wide eyes. "Dr. Vasquez," he said quietly, "this looks like the Earth is trying to talk to us." That's when Elena knew she wasn't going crazy. The planet was actually trying to communicate with humanity, and somehow she was the only person who could understand what it was saying. Elena decided to dig deeper into the data. She started looking at earthquake patterns, ocean current changes, and even the way birds were migrating. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The Earth was conscious. It was aware of what was happening to it, and it was desperately trying to get our attention. The more Elena studied these patterns, the more clear the messages became. The Earth was telling us that we had pushed it too far. The damage we had done with pollution, deforestation, and burning fossil fuels had reached a point where the planet couldn't heal itself anymore. We had maybe 18 months before everything would collapse completely. But the Earth wasn't just giving us bad news. It was also trying to tell us how to fix things. The patterns showed us which areas needed to be protected first, which types of pollution were causing the most damage, and what changes would have the biggest impact on saving the planet. Elena knew she couldn't keep this discovery to herself. She started writing reports and making presentations to show other scientists what she had found. Most of them thought she was having a mental breakdown. Climate change was real, they said, but the idea that the Earth could talk to us was impossible. However, a few scientists started to take her seriously when they looked at her data carefully. The patterns were too organized to be accidents. There had to be some kind of intelligence behind them. Even if they didn't believe the Earth was actually talking, they had to admit that something very strange was happening. Word about Elena's research started spreading to government officials and world leaders. In June 2023, she received a phone call that changed her life forever. The United Nations wanted to meet with her. They had been looking at her research, and they believed her discoveries were important enough to share with the whole world. 3 weeks later, Elena found herself standing in a conference room filled with presidents, prime ministers, and other powerful people from around the globe. She had never been so nervous in her life. These were the people who could actually do something about climate change, but they were also the people who had been ignoring the problem for decades. Elena presented her findings as clearly as she could. She showed them the patterns in the data, explained how the messages appeared in weather systems, and told them about the 18-month deadline. The room was completely silent as she spoke. She could see some people taking notes, others looking skeptical, and a few who seemed genuinely frightened by what she was telling them. When she finished her presentation, the Secretary General of the United Nations stood up. He thanked Elena for her work, and then said something that surprised everyone in the room, including Elena herself. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, "we would like to offer you a position as Earth's official ambassador. Your job would be to continue studying these communications and help us understand what actions we need to take to prevent this disaster." Elena couldn't believe what she was hearing. She would be the first person in history to have the official title of speaking for the planet Earth. It was an honor, but it was also a huge responsibility. If she was right about the 18-month deadline, she would be responsible for convincing the most powerful people in the world to make changes. That could save humanity. Over the next few months, Elena traveled to every major capital city in the world. She met with presidents, CEOs of major corporations, and military leaders. She showed them her data and explained what the Earth was trying to tell us. The messages were becoming clearer and more urgent every day, but Elena quickly realized that understanding the problem and actually doing something about it were two very different things. Most of the leaders she met with nodded politely during her presentations. They said they understood the seriousness of the situation. They promised to consider making changes. But when she followed up with them weeks later, nothing had actually changed. Oil companies were still drilling in new locations. Factories were still pumping pollution into the air. Governments were still making promises they had no intention of keeping. Elena watched the patterns in her data becoming more desperate and angry as the months passed. The Earth was running out of patience by December 2023. Elena's research that the 18-month deadline was actually much shorter than she had originally calculated. The Earth's messages were now showing up in more dramatic ways. Hurricanes were forming in patterns that spelled out words like urgent and no. Earthquake sequences were creating rhythms that sounded like heartbeats getting faster and faster. The most frightening discovery came when Elena realized that the Earth had started keeping track of which people were helping and which people were making things worse. The natural disasters that were happening around the world weren't random anymore. They were targeting specific areas where the worst polluters lived and worked. Elena tried to warn people about this pattern, but most thought she was becoming too extreme in her theories. Even some of her supporters started to worry that the pressure of her job was affecting her mental health. But Elena knew what she was seeing in the data. The Earth wasn't just trying to communicate anymore. It was starting to take action out as 2024 began. Elena realized that her role as Earth's ambassador was becoming more dangerous every day. Some very powerful people were getting tired of hearing her warnings. They saw her as a threat to their businesses and their way of life. She started receiving angry emails and phone calls from people who wanted her to stop talking about climate change. But Elena couldn't stop. Every day, the messages from the Earth were becoming more clear and more urgent. The planet was telling her that time was almost up. If humanity didn't change course immediately, there would be consequences that no one could imagine. Elena knew that she was probably the only person on Earth who could understand these messages. That made her incredibly important, but it also made her incredibly vulnerable. She was starting to realize that some people might do anything to silence her, including things that could put her life in danger. As she prepared for what might be her final presentations to world leaders, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that she was running out of time in more ways than one. The Earth was running out of patience, and her enemies were running out of patience with her warnings. But she had made a promise to speak for the planet, and she intended to keep that promise, no matter what happened to her. Elena had been Earth's ambassador for 6 months when she made the discovery that would change everything. It was a rainy Thursday evening in March 2024, and she was working late in her laboratory as usual. Her team had gone home hours ago, but Elena couldn't sleep anymore. Every night, she stayed up studying the data, hoping to find new ways to convince world leaders that time was running out. That night, something different appeared on her computer screen. The atmospheric readings weren't just showing random patterns anymore. They were showing something that looked like mathematical equations. Elena stared at the screen for a long time, trying to understand what she was seeing. Then it hit her like lightning. The Earth wasn't just sending simple messages like, "Help us," anymore. It was sending complex information about exactly what was happening to the planet and why. The equations showed how pollution was affecting the atmosphere, how deforestation was changing weather patterns, and how ocean warming was creating chain reactions that would destroy entire ecosystems. But the most amazing part was that these equations also contained solutions. The Earth was literally teaching humanity how to fix the problems we had created. It was showing us which technologies would work best, which areas needed protection first, and exactly how much time we had to make each change. Elena couldn't contain her excitement. She called her research partner, Dr. Chun, even though it was almost midnight. Chun had been one of the few scientists who believed Elena's theories from the beginning. He rushed to the laboratory and spent the next 4 hours going through the data with her. "This is incredible," Chun whispered as he looked at the patterns. "It's like having a conversation with the planet itself. The Earth is trying to teach us how to save it." Elena and Chun worked through the night, documenting every equation and pattern they could find. By morning, they had discovered something that made Elena's previous findings look simple. The Earth wasn't just aware of what was happening to it. It was actually intelligent enough to calculate solutions and communicate them to humans. Elena knew this discovery would change everything. She immediately requested emergency meetings with world leaders, promising them that she had found the key to solving climate change. Within 2 weeks, she was standing in front of the same group of presidents and prime ministers who had made her Earth's ambassador. This time, Elena's presentation was different. Instead of just showing them problems, she was showing them solutions. The Earth had given humanity a complete roadmap for healing the planet. It included detailed plans for clean energy systems, new ways to grow food without damaging soil, and methods for removing pollution from the atmosphere. Elena expected the world leaders to be excited about these discoveries. After all, the Earth itself was offering to help us solve the climate crisis. But instead of excitement, she saw something else in their faces. Fear. Not fear of climate change, but fear of what these solutions would mean for their power and wealth. The oil company executives who were present looked particularly worried. If the world followed the Earth's suggestions, their companies would become worthless overnight. The manufacturing bosses realized that they would have to completely change how their factories operated. Even some government leaders understood that these changes would upset the wealthy people who funded their political campaigns. After Elena finished her presentation, the room was silent for a long time. Finally, One of the oil executives stood up and spoke in a cold voice. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, "these are very interesting theories, but we need to be practical. The changes you're suggesting would destroy the global economy. Millions of people would lose their jobs. Perhaps we should focus on slower, more manageable approaches to climate change." Elena couldn't believe what she was hearing. The Earth was offering humanity a way to survive, and these people were worried about their profits. She tried to explain that there wouldn't be any economy left if the planet became uninhabitable, but the executives and politicians had already made up their minds. Over the next few weeks, Elena watched in horror as the world's most powerful people began working together to ignore her discoveries. They held their own meetings without inviting her. They hired scientists to write reports that contradicted her research. They told news reporters that Elena was becoming unstable under the pressure of her job, but Elena kept working. The messages from the Earth were becoming more frequent and more detailed every day. She discovered that the planet was not only aware of climate change, but it was also keeping track of human behavior. It knew which countries were trying to help and which ones were making things worse. It knew which companies were lying about their pollution levels and which politicians were taking money from oil companies. Most frightening of all, Elena realized that the Earth was starting to lose patience with humanity. The early messages had been gentle requests for help. Now they were becoming warnings about what would happen if people didn't start listening. John noticed the change in the data too. "Look at these patterns," he said one morning, pointing at his computer screen. "The earthquakes that happened last month weren't random. They all occurred near major oil drilling sites. And these hurricane paths, they're hitting cities where the biggest polluting factories are located." Elena studied the data Chun was showing her and felt her blood run cold. The Earth wasn't just communicating anymore. It was starting to take action against the people and companies that were destroying it. The natural disasters that were happening around the world weren't accidents. They were the planet's way of fighting back. Elena tried to warn people about this new development, but by now, very few people were willing to listen to her. The oil companies and manufacturing bosses had launched a massive campaign to discredit her work. They paid other scientists to say that Elena's theories were impossible. They convinced news reporters to write stories suggesting that Elena was mentally ill. Even worse, they started targeting Elena personally. Someone broke into her laboratory and destroyed months of research. Her funding was suddenly cut by government agencies that had previously supported her work. She received hundreds of angry emails and phone calls from people who blamed her for causing panic about climate change. Elena's life became a constant struggle. She had to hire security guards to protect her home and office. She couldn't go anywhere without looking over her shoulder to see if someone was following her. Several times, she noticed strange cars parked outside her house or men in suits watching her from across the street. Despite all the pressure and threats, Elena continued her research. She had made a promise to speak for the Earth, and she wasn't going to break that promise. But the data she was collecting was becoming more frightening every day. The Earth's messages were no longer just about climate change. They were about something much more serious. The planet was preparing to defend itself against humanity. Elena discovered patterns in the data that looked like countdown sequences. It was as if the Earth was giving humanity a final deadline to change course before taking drastic action. Elena calculated that this countdown would reach 0 in exactly 8 months. She didn't know what would happen when it did, but based on the increasingly violent natural disasters that were targeting polluters, she knew it wouldn't be good. Elena requested one more emergency meeting with world leaders. This time, she didn't just present her research. She begged them to listen. She showed them the countdown sequences and explained that the Earth was preparing for some kind of final action against humanity. "Please," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "You have to understand. The Earth isn't just a rock floating in space. It's alive, it's intelligent, and it's running out of patience with us. We still have 8 months to show that we're serious about change. If we don't act now, I don't think we'll get another chance." But the response was the same as always. Polite smiles, empty promises, and no real action. As Elena left the meeting, she overheard 2 oil executives talking. In the hallway, "She's becoming a real problem," one of them said quietly. "Maybe it's time we found a more permanent solution." Elena pretended not to hear them, but their words sent a chill down her spine. She realized that these people weren't just ignoring her warnings anymore. They were starting to see her as an enemy who needed to be stopped. That night, Elena went home and made a video recording explaining everything she had discovered. She hid copies of all her research in secret locations and sent the data to trusted scientists around the world. If something happened to her, she wanted to make sure that someone else could continue her work. As Elena looked out her window at the city lights below, she could feel the Earth's pain like a physical ache in her chest. The planet was crying out for help, and the people with the power to save it were more interested in silencing the messenger than hearing the message. Elena knew that her time as Earth's ambassador was running out. The countdown in the data was approaching 0, and the threats against her were becoming more serious every day. But she also knew that she couldn't give up. The Earth was depending on her, and she was the only person who could hear its voice. Tomorrow, she would try once more to convince the world to listen. She just hoped she would live long enough to deliver the message. The snow was falling heavily on the mountain road that cold February evening in 2024. Helena gripped her steering wheel tightly as she drove through the winding curves, trying to see through the thick snowfall. She was on her way to what might be the most important meeting of her life, an emergency climate summit where world leaders had finally agreed to hear her latest findings. Elena had spent the past 3 weeks preparing for this presentation. The countdown in the Earth's data had reached a critical point. She had discovered that the planet was planning something massive for when the sequence reaches 0 in just 2 months. The patterns in her research showed that the Earth had lost all patience with humanity and was preparing to take drastic action. Her laptop bag sat on the passenger seat next to her, containing 5 years of irreplaceable research data. Everything was in there: the original atmospheric patterns that first revealed the Earth's consciousness, the mathematical equations showing solutions to climate change, and most importantly, the countdown sequence that predicted humanity's final deadline. Elena had tried calling ahead to the summit location, but her phone had no signal in these remote mountains. The weather was getting worse by the minute, and she was starting to worry that she might not make it to the meeting on time. But she had to keep going. This was humanity's last chance to hear what the Earth was trying to tell them. What Elena didn't know was that her enemies had been planning this moment for weeks. The oil executives and government officials who wanted her silenced had been tracking her every movement. They knew about the summit, they knew the route she would take, and they knew this mountain road would be the perfect place to make her disappear forever. 3 days earlier, a team of mechanics had worked on Elena's car while it was parked outside her hotel. They had carefully damaged the brake system in a way that would cause complete failure after a certain amount of use. To anyone investigating later, it would look like a tragic accident caused by bad weather and mechanical problems. As Elena drove higher into the mountains, she noticed that her brakes were feeling softer than usual. At first, she thought it might be because of the cold weather or the wet snow on the road. But when she tried to slow down for a sharp curve, the brake pedal went all the way to the floor without stopping the car. Elena's heart started racing as she realized what was happening. Her brakes had completely failed, and she was picking up speed as the road went downhill. She tried pumping the brakes and pulling the emergency brake, But nothing worked. The car was now moving too fast for the icy conditions, and she was approaching. A series of dangerous curves with steep drops on one side. Elena fought to control the steering wheel as the car slid sideways on the icy road. She could see the guardrail rushing toward her, and beyond that, a cliff that dropped hundreds of feet into a rocky canyon. In those final moments, Elena thought about all the warnings she had tried to give the world, all the solutions the Earth had shared with her, and how it was all going to die with her on this lonely mountain road. The car crashed through the guardrail and tumbled down the mountainside, rolling over and over before smashing into the rocks below. Elena's last conscious thought was that she had failed the Earth and all of humanity. The crash site wasn't discovered until the next morning, when a snowplow driver noticed the broken guardrail. By the time rescue teams reached Elena's car, she had been dead for hours. The investigators who examined the wreckage found evidence of brake failure, exactly as Elena's enemies had planned. But there was one thing the investigators didn't find: Elena's laptop. A bag that had been sitting on her passenger seat was nowhere to be found. Someone had reached the crash site before the rescue teams and removed the one thing that contained all of Elena's research. Back at Elena's laboratory, Dr. Chun was getting worried. Elena was supposed to have arrived at the summit the night before, but no one had heard from her. When Chun called the summit organizers, they told him that Elena had never showed up for her presentation. Chun immediately knew something was wrong. Chun tried calling Elena's phone over and over, but it went straight to voicemail. He called the police and reported her missing, but they told him to wait 24 hours before filing an official report. Chun couldn't wait that long. He got in his car and drove toward the mountain location where the summit was being held. When Chun heard on the radio that a car had crashed on the mountain road, his worst fears were confirmed. He drove straight to the crash site and arrived just as the rescue teams were bringing Elena's body up from the canyon. Chun fell to his knees in the snow, crying for his friend and colleague who had died trying to save the world. Chun's grief quickly turned to anger when he realized that Elena's research was missing. He knew Elena never went anywhere without her laptop, especially to such an important meeting. Someone had taken it, and Chun was pretty sure he knew who was responsible. Chun spent the next few days going through Elena's office and laboratory, looking for backup copies of her research. What he found hidden in Elena's desk drawer changed everything. Elena had been keeping a secret journal, documenting all the threats she had received and all the suspicious activities she had noticed around her work. The journal revealed that Elena had been under surveillance for months. She had noticed the same cars following her to different locations. She had received threatening phone calls from people who knew details about her personal life that they shouldn't have known. Most disturbing of all, she had discovered that her laboratory was being monitored by hidden cameras and listening devices. Elena's journal also contained detailed records of her latest research findings. In the weeks before her death, she had discovered something that terrified her more than anything she had seen before. The Earth's countdown wasn't just leading to natural disasters. It was leading to something much worse. According to Elena's calculations, the Earth had decided that humanity was beyond saving. The planet was preparing to eliminate the human species entirely and start over with other forms of life. A countdown was marking the days until the Earth would unleash disasters so massive that no human civilization could survive them. But the most chilling discovery in Elena's journal was her final entry, written just hours before she left for the mountain summit. In it, she wrote about how the Earth's communications had changed after each attempt to silence her. The planet wasn't just aware of climate change anymore. It was aware of the conspiracy against Elena herself. Elena's final words in the journal were prophetic. They think that removing me will stop the Earth's message, but they don't understand. I was never the source of these communications. I was just the translator. The Earth has been watching everything. That's happened to me, and it's learning about human nature. Now that they're planning to hurt me, I think the Earth is going to stop being patient and start being angry." Chun realized that Elena had predicted her own death. She had known that powerful people wanted her silenced, and she had understood that her death would trigger something terrible in the Earth's response to humanity. Within hours of Elena's death, strange things started happening around the world. The weather patterns that Elena had been tracking suddenly became more violent and more focused. Instead of random natural disasters, specific locations were being hit with impossible precision. The oil executive who had ordered Elena's death lived in a mansion in Texas. On the morning after Elena died, a massive sinkhole opened up directly underneath his house, swallowing the entire building in seconds. Geological experts said it was impossible for such a large sinkhole to form so quickly in that type of soil. The government official who had approved the plan to silence Elena was struck by lightning while walking out of his office building in Washington, D.C. The strange thing was that it was a completely clear day with no storms anywhere in the area. The lightning bolt seemed to come from nowhere and struck only him, leaving everyone around him completely unharmed. The military contractor who had arranged for Elena's car to be sabotaged died in a localized earthquake that destroyed only his building while leaving all the surrounding structures completely untouched. Seismologists couldn't explain how an earthquake could be so precise that it affected only one specific building. Chun watched these events unfold with a mixture of amazement and terror. He realized that Elena had been right about everything. The Earth was conscious, it was intelligent, and it had been watching the conspiracy against its chosen ambassador. Now that Elena was dead, the planet was taking revenge against everyone who had been involved in silencing her. But Chun also understood that this was just the beginning. According to Elena's research, the countdown was still approaching 0. The Earth's revenge against Elena's killers was just a preview of what would happen to all of humanity when the final deadline arrived. Chun knew he was now the only person left who could understand the Earth's communications. He also knew that made him incredibly dangerous to the sane people who had eliminated Elena. As he prepared to continue Elena's work, Chun couldn't shake the feeling that he was already being watched. The Earth had lost its ambassador, and now it was preparing to deliver its final message to humanity. Chun just hoped he would live long enough to help people understand what was coming, even though he suspected it might already be too late to stop it. Dr. Chun couldn't sleep for 3 days after Elena's funeral. Every time he closed his eyes, he could hear her voice warning him about what was coming. The countdown in Elena's research had reached 15 days, and Chun was the only person left who understood what that meant. The Earth was preparing to end its relationship with humanity forever. Chun had taken over Elena's laboratory and was working around the clock to decode the planet's final messages. What he discovered made him wish he had never learned to read the data. The Earth wasn't just planning to punish the people who had hurt Elena. It was planning to remove the entire human species from existence. The atmospheric readings showed patterns that Chun had never seen before. Instead of the organized communication signals that Elena had first discovered, the data now looked like battle plans. The Earth was coordinating weather systems, tectonic movements, and ocean currents in ways that would create disasters beyond anything humans had ever experienced. But the most terrifying discovery was that these disasters wouldn't be random. The Earth had been studying human civilization for months, learning about our cities, our infrastructure, and our weaknesses. The planet knew exactly how to destroy everything we had built in the most efficient way possible. Chun tried to warn people about what was coming, but nobody wanted to listen. After Elena's death, the oil companies and government officials had launched a massive campaign to discredit all climate research. They told the public that Elena had been mentally unstable and that her death proved how dangerous it was to believe. In extreme climate theories, the news media refused to report on Chun's warnings. Social media companies blocked his posts about the countdown. Even other scientists were afraid to support his research because they didn't want to lose their jobs or funding. Chun felt completely alone as he watched the final days tick away. On the Earth's deadline dot with 10 days left on the countdown, the first major signs of the Earth's plan began to appear. Ocean temperatures around the world started rising at impossible rates. Within 48 hours, the water was so hot that millions of fish began dying and floating to the surface. Coastal cities reported that the ocean felt like bathwater, even in areas that were normally cold. Weather systems that had been stable for decades suddenly became chaotic. Hurricanes formed in minutes instead of days. Tornadoes appeared in places where they had never been seen before. Snow fell in tropical regions, while desert areas experienced floods that seemed to come from nowhere. But the strangest part was how precise these disasters were. The worst storms kept hitting the headquarters of major oil companies. Floods seemed to target the factories that produced the most pollution. Earthquakes struck directly under the homes of politicians who had spent years denying climate change. Chun realized that the Earth wasn't just destroying human civilization randomly. It was systematically eliminating the people and institutions that had caused the most damage to the planet. The Earth had kept detailed records of human behavior for years, and now it was using that information to decide who would be punished first. With 7 days left on the countdown, entire cities began experiencing impossible weather events. New York City was hit by a blizzard in the middle of summer, with snow accumulating at a rate of several feet per hour. Miami experienced temperatures of over 140 degrees Fahrenheit, making it impossible for people to go outside during the day. Los Angeles was shaken by continuous earthquakes that seemed to follow a rhythm, like a giant heartbeat coming from deep underground. The tremors were strong enough to crack buildings, but not strong enough to make people evacuate, creating a constant state of terror and uncertainty. Meanwhile, farmland around the world began failing in ways that scientists couldn't explain. Crops that should have thrived in certain climates were dying overnight. Soil that had been fertile for generations suddenly became barren. Rivers and lakes that provided water for irrigation were either drying up completely or becoming so polluted that nothing could grow. Sean understood what was happening. The Earth was cutting off humanity's food supply to make sure that even if some people survived the initial disasters, they wouldn't be able to rebuild their civilization afterward. With 5 days left on the countdown, the disasters became so severe that governments around the world declared states of emergency. But their emergency plans were useless because the disasters weren't following any patterns that humans could predict or prepare for. Military bases were hit by tornadoes that appeared and disappeared within minutes. Power plants experienced equipment failures that couldn't be explained by any known scientific principles. Communication systems went down as satellites mysteriously stopped working, leaving entire continents unable to contact each other. Shun tried one last time to get world leaders to listen to his warnings. He sent messages to every government official he could contact, explaining that the Earth was about to implement its final plan for removing humanity. He begged them to acknowledge what they had done and asked the planet for forgiveness. But it was too late. The people who might have been able to change the Earth's mind were the same people who had ordered Elena's death. They were more concerned with protecting their wealth and power than with saving the human species. With 3 days left, Chan made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of trying to save humanity, he decided to document what was happening, so that maybe someday other forms of life could learn from humanity's mistakes. Chun spent those final days creating a comprehensive record of everything Elena had discovered and everything he had witnessed since her death. He recorded videos explaining how the Earth had tried to communicate with humans, how humanity had responded with violence and greed, and how the planet had finally given up on trying to save the species that was destroying it. He hid copies of this record in multiple locations around the world, hoping that somehow they would survive whatever the Earth was planning to do. Chun wanted future civilizations to understand that Earth was not just a dead rock floating in space. It was a living, thinking entity that could be patient and forgiving, but also protective of itself when necessary. With one day left on the countdown, Sean received the most beautiful and terrifying message he had ever seen in the atmospheric data. The Earth was saying goodbye to humanity, not with anger or hatred, but with sadness. The planet had genuinely hoped that humans could learn to live in harmony with nature, but it had finally accepted that this was impossible. The message contained detailed explanations of everything the Earth was about to do. Ocean levels would rise by hundreds of feet within hours, drowning coastal cities around the world. Volcanic eruptions would block out the sun for years, making it impossible to grow food. Ice ages and heat waves would alternate so rapidly that no living thing could adapt fast enough to survive. But the Earth also sent a final gift to humanity. Buried in the data was information about other planets where human-like species had successfully learned to live in balance with their environments. The Earth was essentially giving humans instructions for how to behave if they ever got a second chance on another world. On the final day of the countdown, Chun sat in Elena's laboratory and watched the world end. It started with a sound that seemed to come from everywhere at once, a deep rumbling that felt like the planet itself was sighing with exhaustion. Then the disasters began happening simultaneously all around the globe. Every ocean rose by 200 feet in less than 6 hours, swallowing every coastal city on Earth. Every volcano erupted at the same time, filling the atmosphere with ash and poisonous gases. Every fault line cracked open, reshaping continents and creating new mountain ranges in minutes. But even as Chun watched his species disappear, he felt a strange sense of peace. Helena had been right about everything. The Earth was alive. It was intelligent, and it had tried everything possible to help humanity survive. When humans responded by destroying their own ambassador, the planet had no choice but to protect itself. As the laboratory shook around him and the air filled with ash, Chun made one final entry in his research log. He wrote that humanity had been given the greatest gift in the universe, a living planet that wanted to work with them, and they had thrown it away for money and power. Chun's last words were a message to any future civilization that might find his records. The Earth is not your enemy. It wants to help you thrive and grow. But if you hurt it the way we did, it will protect itself. Learn from our mistakes. Be better than we were. The laboratory collapsed, and Chun's voice joined Elena's in whatever place the spirits of Earth's ambassadors go when their work is finally finished. In the years that followed, the Earth slowly began healing itself. New forms of life evolved to fill the spaces that humans had left empty. The planet occasionally sent out messages to the universe, hoping to attract species that might be wiser and more caring than the ones that had come before. And somewhere, in the cosmic noise between stars, the Earth's messages mixed with similar signals from other worlds, all of them singing the same sad song about intelligent species that had forgotten how to listen to the voices of their own planets. The Earth was patient. It had time to wait for better children.